Hey everyone, welcome to Data Millennials. I'm Atul, and in this video we are going to see how we can create and customize pivot table in our Looker dashboard. You have most often heard and mostly used pivot tables in Excel, but Looker provides you the functionality to create and customize the pivot table to narrow down a large data set or analyze relationship between data points. Pivot table reorganize your dimensions and matrices to help you quickly summarize your data and see relationship that might otherwise be hard to spot. So we will be creating this pivot table which you can see on a screen from scratch. But before we go ahead and start creating this pivot table, let's first discuss what exactly a pivot table is and how it can be useful in your dashboard. A pivot table is a statistical tool that summarizes and reorganizes the selected columns and rows of data in the Looker table to obtain a desired report. The tool does not actually change the data itself, it simply pivots or turns the data to view it from different perspectives. So as you can see over here, we have this pivot table, and I have created this pivot table from this raw data which we will be using in our example today. So we have country code, number of items sold in thousands, date, and revenue in millions. So as you can see this raw data, it's very hard to see any kind of relationship between number of items sold and revenue. But if we see this pivot table, you might be able to figure out that there is a relationship between number of items sold and revenue. So as the number of items sold increases, revenue also increases. As the number of items sold decreases, revenue also decreases for that specific day in both of these two countries, which is India and Bahrain. Pivot tables are especially useful with large amounts of data that would be time consuming to calculate manually or by hand. A few data processing functions a pivot table can perform include identifying sums, average, ranges, or outliers. The table then arranges this information in a simple, meaningful layout, as you can see over here, that draws the attention to its key values. Now the question that should come to your mind is that how pivot table works and how can we create it. So pivot table in Looker Studio takes the rows in a standard table and pivot them so they become column. This lets you group and summarize the data in ways a standard table cannot provide. So when we create a pivot table, there are four main components. The first component is column. And when a field is chosen for the column area, only the unique values of the field are listed across the top. As you can see over here, only two values are visible over here, IN and BH, which is India and Bahrain. But if you see our raw data, we have 44 rows that includes Bahrain and India. And if we distribute it, then it will be equally distributed, says that 22 rows of Bahrain and 22 rows of India. But in our column, as you can see over here, only 2 is appearing, because in pivot table, when a field is chosen for the column area, only the unique values of the fields are listed across the top. Now the next main component of pivot table is rows. So these are rows. When a field is chosen for row area, it populates as the first column. As you can see over here, it is the first column. Similar to the columns, all row labels are unique and duplicates are removed. The third main component of pivot table is values. Each value is kept in a pivot table cell and displays the summarized information. This is the summarized information. The most common values are sum, average, minimum, and maximum that on a day-to-day basis we are using in our pivot table. The last main component of pivot table is filters. Filters apply a calculation or restriction to the entire table. So whenever you want to filter out any of your data values, then you can use filter in your pivot table to remove that specific data from your calculations. So this pivot table is a standard table listing the day-on-day sales, quantity, and revenue in millions by calendar date and by country. While this table is useful for showing which country has the most revenue and the high quantity of sales, it is also useful for summarizing the data in a meaningful way. A pivot table, however, quickly shows the relationship of this data. This table easily summarizes the data, and you can also quickly spot outliers or anomalies in your data. Pivot table in Looker supports adding multiple rows and column dimension, which further breaks down the data, giving you even more insight into your data. So let's go and create a pivot table just like this from scratch as an example. So what I'm going to do over here is that I'm going to click on this edit button so that I can get into edit mode. Then I'll go to a second page and we will create that pivot table from scratch on the second page. The first thing that you need to create a pivot table is your data source. If you have already added your data source into your Looker, then you can go ahead and start creating pivot table. But if you have not added it, then you can click on resources. Then you can click on manage added data sources. Then you have an option to add a data source over here. You can click on it and you will get redirected to this Google connector option. You can select any of the Google connectors over here and add your data source. Once you have added your data source, then you can go ahead and add your pivot table. So to add a pivot table, you have to click on add a chart option. Once you click on it, then you will see over here that you have an option of pivot table. Under this pivot table, the first option is the simplest pivot table, which we are going to use in this video. So you can click on this, and once you click on this, then Looker will allow you to add that pivot table on your blank page. And the moment the pivot table is appearing on your page, you will see that Looker has by default added or selected some of your fields as row dimension, column dimension, and some of your columns as your matrices. So we are going to edit this pivot table based on our requirement, and as we are going to edit it, we are also going to discuss about each and every option in this setup section as well as in this style section. So we will be discussing about the setup section and style, and simultaneously we will be editing this pivot table to get our desired output, which is something like this. So we need date in our first column. Against each date we want number of items sold in 1000, revenue in millions for each country that we have in our raw data. So let's go to this setup section first. So this setup section is a chart setup panel, and it determines how the data is organized and displayed. Within this setup section, the first option that we have is data source, and a data source provides the connection between the component, which is this pivot table, and the underlying data. Suppose if you have added n number of data sources and you need to create a pivot table from another data source, or your data source have changed, then what you can do is that you can click on this data source option and you have your added data sources over here. You can select any of the added data source from here, or else if you want to add a new data source, you can click on add data and it will take you to Google connector section. You can select your connector and then you can add your data, and the pivot table will take that underlying data which you have added just now. Now the next option that we have is date range dimension over here. This option appears if your data source has a valid date dimension. This date dimension is used as the basis for limiting the date range of the pivot. For example, if a viewer of the report uses a date range control to limit the time frame, then he will only be able to see the data in pivot of that selected date range. And as I have told you earlier, that this option appears if your data source has a valid date range. As you can see over here in our raw data, we have a column called date, which is in an appropriate date format. So Looker has automatically selected this date column for date range dimension. Now the next option that we have in setup is row dimension. Before we discuss about the row dimension, let's discuss what exactly is dimension. Dimensions are data categories, and the dimension values is the data contained by the dimensions, such as names, description, or other characteristics of a category. So this row dimension provides the breakdown of rows in a pivot table. As you can see over here, by default, Looker has taken country code ISO 2 as our row dimension, but what we need over here in our row dimension is the dates. So what we can do is that we can remove this country code and take this date. So what will happen is that in each and every row we'll have date, but this date values will be unique. As you can see over here, we have repeating dates, but in our pivot table, the row will contain unique date values on the first column. Now, if you want to add another dimensions, you can add it over here. For example, if I want to add country over here, I can add country over here after date, and then you will have date and then country code. But we want our country code in our columns, so we'll remove this from here. Now the next option within row dimension is this expand and collapse. If you turn on this expand and collapse, then it will treat the row dimension as an expandable hierarchy. As you can see over here, I have turned on this expand and collapse, and first what happened is that the hierarchy has created year, then year, month, and then date. As we have only data for like 15 days or 10 days in this January 2023, so we do not need this hierarchy. But you need to understand about this expand and collapse option is that the order in which you list the columns over here as a dimension within the hierarchy matters. And as a rule of thumb, you should define hierarchy to always go from most general to the most specific. For example, you can define a geographic hierarchy such as continent, subcontinent, country, state, city, and district, and it could produce a desirable result. But if you want to put a hierarchy something like this, that country and then you put a subcontinent, it will not work. You will not get a desired result. So whenever you're using this expand and collapse, you have to make sure that your defined hierarchies are in a proper way or in a correct way. For now, we'll turn this off and we'll remove this year, month and this year, and we'll keep only date in our row dimension. The next option in setup is column dimension. So column dimension provides the column in the pivot table, and we can reorder that column dimension listed to change the order of the column in your table. So as per our requirement, we required country in our column, not the dates. So we'll remove this date and we'll add country ISO 2 or country code ISO 2. Now as you can see over here, we have two columns as we have two unique distinct values in our raw data over here. The first value is Bahrain and the second value is India. That's why we have only Bahrain and India in our column of the pivot table. The next option within setup is metric. So metric measures the things contained in your dimension and provide the numerical scale and data series for the chart. As you can see over here, we can see that for 5th of January 2023, we have 2 record count for Bahrain and 2 record count for India. So this is the numerical scale as we are using the record count. So metrics are the aggregation that comes from the underlying data set, or it is the result of the implicit or explicitly applying an aggregate function. So we can use different aggregate functions in our metric value. So for us, what we need to do over here is that we need to take number of items sold in 1000 and revenue in millions. So we'll take it one by one. The first we'll take number of items sold in 1000, and then we'll take revenue in millions. So as you can see over here, we have each country, and within this each country we have two different columns, number of items sold and revenue in million, and these two columns are the matrices for India and these two columns are matrices for Bahrain, and this Bahrain and India is a column dimension. Now the next option within this matrix is this optional matrix. With this optional matrix, we can define a list of additional matrices that can be displayed by the table. For example, if I want to show the record count, I can add a metric and says show me record count. But this optional metric will only work when you basically select that optional matrix to get reflected on your pivot table. So let me go and click on view, and as you can see over here that we have this option which says optional metrics. If you click on it, then you can select this record count and your pivot table will start reflecting record count based on your requirement. So let's unselect this for this moment and again click back to edit so that we can go ahead and discuss more about the setup section. Now after this matrices, we have totals. So It displays the total of each row and column. If you have only one dimension in a row or column, the option is to display a grand total. If you have two or more dimensions, the option includes subtotals also and grand totals also. So we only have one dimension in each of the row and column, as we have date only as one dimension and country or ISO code as one dimension in columns. So we are not seeing this subtotals option over here, but we have option for show grand total for rows. If you select this, then you will be able to see the grand total at last. And for columns, you have show grand total, and if you select this, then you will be able to see the grand total of each column. So after these totals, we have an option for sorting. This sorting option lets you control the order of the data displayed in pivot table. In addition, you can limit the number of rows and columns displayed using this sorting. Now if you'll see over here, then you have sorting for row 1. This is row 1. So this is your row, right? You can select your sorting options over here. You can select date, and then based on your requirement you can select ascending or descending. Similarly, for column 1 you have sorting option for number of items sold, revenue in millions, and country code ISO, right? So based on your requirement you can generally select ascending or descending for each column and row as a sorting option. The next that we have over here is default date range. So this default date range property lets you set a time frame for an individual chart or this pivot table. And default date range has 3 options. The first option is auto. It uses the default date range determined by the chart's data source. So when we select auto, it will determine the dates or date range based on the number of dates that you have in your raw data. When you select custom, then it lets you use the calendar widget over here by clicking over here, and you will be able to select custom date range for the chart. And you have multiple options over here to select from. So you can select fixed dates. If you select fixed date, then you can select starting date and end date. Then you have last 7 date, and then you have n number of options over here. Based on your requirement you can select this option. Okay, so for us we'll select auto over here in our default date range. Then the last option in setup that we have is filter. So filter restrict the data that is displayed in the component or in your pivot table by including or excluding values that you want to specify. For example, if you want to add a filter, you can click on add a filter, and then you can click on create a filter. Then you will come up over this page where you need to put a name of the filter, so that in future when you open this to edit this looker report, you can understand what exactly filter you have applied by looking at the name. Then you have to either select this option include or exclude based on your requirement, and then you have to select a field from which you want to include or exclude. Then you have to select a condition from here. Once you select a condition, then you can put the value, and then you have to click on save. Once you click on save, then this component or this pivot table that you have created will display data based on the selection or exclusion or inclusion that you have given over here in the pivot table. So let me close this because we do not want any filter in our pivot table, and go back. So that was the last option in setup. Filtration was the last option. Now we'll go ahead and discuss each and every component of style. So style properties is a chart's style property that control the overall presentation and appearance of the chart. So the first option within your style property is conditional formatting. It allows you to format your table based on a certain condition or rules. If you want to add colors or something else, then you can click on this conditional formatting add. Then you have 2 options over here, single color and color scale. Okay, and you can select the conditions. So let's go ahead with single color, and you can select a matrix over here. So let's select number of items sold in 1000, and the condition, if the number of items sold is above average, we can put it into a color, right? So let's put equal to and input value. So when you are selecting a field, it will always take sum. So instead of taking sum, what we can do is that we can come over here and we can take average of this entire thing from our raw data. So the average is 53. We can simply put the value over here saying that if it is equal to or greater than, let's take equal to, greater than and equal to 53, then you have to select a color. So we'll take the font color default and we'll put a background color saying that let's put it into green. Okay, and then we'll click on save. So this is how basically you can add conditional formatting in your pivot table. And if you want to add another conditional formatting, again you can click over there, you can click on this add option and you can select your color type. Okay, and based on your requirement you can select either in metric, row, column, any, and then you can go ahead with the creation of rules. The next option that we have over here is table header. So this option controls the appearance of your data table. The first option is header color option. It changes the font color of your table header. The second option is header font size. It changes the font size of the table header. And then the last option that we have within this table header is header font family. It changes the font family of the table header. So the next option that we have is table colors. So this option controls the color of the table border and cells. The first option that we have here is header background color. It sets the color of the table header background. So let's select this yellow color. Okay, and as you can see, the color had started appearing over here. Now the next option that we have is cell border color. If you want to change the cell border color, you can select from here. We have selected red. Next option that we have is highlight color. It sets the color of the highlighted bar. So when you go over here, you can see that the highlighted color is gray, right? So let's change it to this blue. Okay, so whenever you put your mouse over a certain row or values, then it will highlight those bars. The next option that we have over here is odd color row. If you want to change the color of odd rows, then you can select from here. Similarly, if you want to change the even color row, then you can do it from here. Okay, then we have an option of table labels. These options control the appearance of your table data. The first option is the font color. It sets the font color of the data. So let's take this black, which is the default. Then the next option is font size. It sets the font size of the data. So let's keep 14. Okay, and the last option is the font family. It sets the font family of the data. So let's take Tahoma over here. Now the next option within style is missing data. This section controls the appearance of the matrices which is missing. Okay, so within this drop down menu you have these 5 options. The first option is show no data. If you have a missing data, then it will show no data. Okay, and if you have a missing data, then you can put it as 0, dash, null, or blank. It's totally on you that what you select if your data is missing on your pivot table. So most often we select this dash. So if there is a missing data, then we can show it as dash. Now the options that we have within style is metrics. If you have n number of metric, then you have this metric hash 1, metric hash 2, metric hash 3, and it will go up to n value. But as we have 2 metric in our pivot table, we have only 2 options, metric 1 and metric 2. So this section controls the appearance of your metric. So the first option is number. It displays the value as it is, but if you want, you can change it to heat map. The next option that we have is bar or pub. It will change it to bar and pub. And you can change the color of the matrices, right? So let's keep it as number because we want this entire pivot table to be as a simple pivot table. Then we have this option of compact number. It rounds the number and displays the unit indicator. So for example, if your number has something like this, like 100,000, then it will simply show 100k. And then we have an option of decimal precision. It sets the number of decimal places in matrices. For example, you have over here, you can see that we have 2 decimal precision. We can change it to 1 decimal precision based on our requirement. For metric 1 over here. Similarly, we would have this decimal precision for metric 2. You can see over here, we can select it to 1, and then for this metric 2, which is revenue in millions, decimal precision will change. So all the metrics options are same. You can select compact numbers, and you can select from this drop down menu either you want to show your numbers as a simple number, or as you want to show it as a heat map, or you want to show it as bar. Now the next option within this style is background and border. So these options control the appearance of the chart background container. So this is your chart background container, okay? And if you want to update it, you can update it from here. The first option is background. It sets the background color. So let's select this color over here, okay? Or let's select other color over here. Yeah. Then we have a border radius. It adds the rounded border to the chart background here. When the radius is 0, then the background shape will be 90-degree corner. When the border radius is 100 degree, then it produces a circular radius, as you can see over here. The next option that we have is opacity. It sets the chart's opacity. When the chart opacity is 100%, it completely hides the object behind the chart, and when it is 0%, then the opacity makes the chart invisible. So it's always advisable to either select 90% or 100% as a chart opacity. The next option within this background and border is this border color. It sets the chart border color. So let's select it as this deep blue, okay? Then we have this option of border weight. It sets the chart border line thickness. So let's keep it at 4. And the last option that we have over here is border style. It sets the chart border line style. So you have 4 different line styles. The first one is solid, which is by default Looker will select for you. The next option is dashed. Then we have an option for dotted, and the last option that we have over here is double. So let's go ahead with dashed. And the last option within this style, as we can see over here, is the add border shadow. It adds shadow to the chart lower and right corner of the border. Then we have this chart header. This chart header lets your viewer perform various actions on the chart, such as exporting the data or viewing the chart into the Explorer tool. Chart header options are show on hover, okay? Then we have option do not show or always show. So based on your requirement, you can select the chart header option. And the last option that we have is a chart header font color. If you want to change the font color over here, then you can select the chart header font colors, okay? So let's go and click on view, and we can see our pivot table over here, right? Now, as we have created this pivot table from scratch, you need to understand there are some of the limitations also of this pivot table. So pivot table can process up to 50,000 rows of data. However, depending on the data set and the dimensions and metrics involved in the table, performance may degrade. You can apply a filter on the pivot table to reduce the amount of data which is getting processed. So suppose if you have more than 50,000 rows of data, you might be able to create a pivot table, but the performance of that report or that Looker page will degrade. So in order to have an optimized performance, what you can do is that you can apply filtration on the pivot table to reduce the amount of data which is getting processed. Now, the next limitation is that you may have up to 5 pivot table per pages in a report. So you can only add 5 pivot table in each of Looker reports. The next limitation is that the number of rows dimension available upon the type of data you are connecting to. So it means that the fixed scheme data sources such as Google Ads or Google Analytics can have up to 5 row dimension or 10 row dimensions. Then the next limitation is that pivot table can have up to 2 column dimension and 10 matrices. Then there is some of the limitations related to the beautification of pivot tables, such as pivot table do not paginate, so you cannot add page number to your pivot tables as you do have in your normal table option in Looker. And the last limitation you can say for pivot table is that you cannot apply metric filter to pivot table, and if you try to do that, then it will display an error message. So this is how basically you can create and customize pivot table in Looker. Happy learning and see you in the next video.